Hey friends, welcome back to the Spooky Files. If you're returning, thank you so much for coming back. If you're new here, we're so glad to have you. I hope you enjoy the show. I'm your host, Mary Ellen Quigley. This is where we dive into the paranormal, the unexplained, the I swear I saw something moments that we all have and now have a place to talk about them. And today's episode is about something that's going to sound very simple, but can be deceptive. A knock, a doorbell, someone calling your name, all things that we have been conditioned to respond to. But in today's episode, we're going to share stories where people heard someone calling their name or summoning them to a window, a door, a threshold, only to find out there's no one there. Or worse, that something was. We're talking about unexplained knocking and ringing doorbells, or what some people call phantom knocks. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and let's get into it. Our first story comes from Lisa, and she titled it The Knocking That Moved from Door to Door. So a pretty simple title for you. And here's what she wrote. Hi, Mary. This happened when I was living alone in a small rental house just outside of town. It wasn't an old house. There was nothing historic about it, just a quiet little place on a gravel road surrounded by trees. The first knock came around 11:30 p.m. 3 knocks, firm and evenly spaced. At first, I thought maybe someone had the wrong house. I turned off the TV and listened, expecting to hear someone walk away or a car door slam. But there was nothing. A few minutes later, the knock came again. Same rhythm. 3 knocks. I finally got up and looked through the peephole. No one was there. I opened the door just a crack and looked outside. The porch light lit up the yard clearly. There was no movement, no footsteps on the gravel, and no person that I could see. So I told myself it must have just been kids messing around, or maybe I was just hearing things, and I went back to bed. About 10 minutes later, the knocking happened again. But this time, it wasn't at the front door. It was at the side door near the kitchen. Once again, 3 knocks. I sat up in bed immediately. The side door is hidden from the street. You have to walk down a narrow path beside the house to reach it, and no one would knock there accidentally. In fact, unless you lived in the neighborhood, you wouldn't even know a door was there. I checked the windows and peered out into the yard. No flashlights, no shadows. There was once again no one there, but this time I refused to open the door. Then it happened again. Back at the front door. 3 knocks. And that's when the pattern became clear. Front door, side door, front door again. Like whatever was knocking was circling the house. I stayed in my bedroom with the lights off, listening and waiting and contemplating whether or not I should call the cops. The last knock came about 20 minutes later. 3 knocks right next to my head on my bedroom window. I jumped out of the bed, ran from my bathroom, closed and locked the door, and called the police. The police checked everything, and they found no footprints, no signs of anyone in the yard, and no person. That was the only time this happened, and I still don't know what was knocking. So what scares me the most about this particular story, and if you've been in the paranormal world, you probably know where I'm going with this. It's not the knocking, it's the pattern of the knocking that would scare me, because I don't necessarily think she was dealing with a person here. So if you've been in the paranormal world for a while, you know that a pattern of 3 is often a hint at demonic activity. So something that's knocking 3 times. I don't know that that's what it was, but I know that as I've done research, that's usually not a good sign. Also, the fact that it was circling the house, I don't know. I have a lot of questions about this, but Lisa, thank you for sharing this. I'm glad it wasn't a person, but also I think for my sake, I probably would have felt safer if it was a person because at least it's someone that the cops could catch or, you could stop from doing this to you again. But the fact that you have no idea what it was, I'm leaning paranormal, but I would love to hear what you guys think in the comment section below. Story 2 comes from Rebecca, and this one I find really interesting. I would be curious to see who you think is ringing the doorbell when we get to the end of the story. And Rebecca calls this one the empty house. She writes, "Hi, Mary. When my grandmother passed away, her house sat empty for several months before we could sell it. There was no furniture and no one living there. We just kept the utilities going to make sure pipes didn't freeze, but it was an empty house that was collecting dust. One afternoon, my mom and I stopped by to check things. We opened a few windows, walked through the rooms, and talked about repairs that needed to be done before listing it. The house felt strange without my grandma in it. You know how homes have a personality when someone lives in them? This one felt paused, like it was waiting. We were standing in the kitchen when the doorbell rang, clear and loud. We both stopped talking immediately because my grandma's doorbell had a very specific chime, 2 notes, and you couldn't mistake it. We used to always laugh because it was such a weird sounding doorbell. So we walked to the door together, laughing about the chime, and opened it. But there was no one there. No cars, no neighbors walking by. My mom laughed and said that maybe some local kids were playing Ding Dong Ditch, so we didn't think anything of it. We went back into the kitchen. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang again. This time we opened the door faster, hoping to catch whoever was doing it and to maybe have a laugh with the kids. But once again, the porch was empty. The third time it rang, we didn't move right away, not because we didn't hear it, but because the chime was different. Instead of the 2 short chimes that we were used to hearing from Grandma's doorbell, this one was long, as though someone was holding down the chime. We looked at each other, because what on earth would cause the doorbell to sound like that? My mother's face was white, and she said, "Don't answer that." And that's when silence returned. We didn't hear any other chimes after that, and we left shortly after. Later that week, the realtor told us something very strange. When the repairman came to fix the doorbell, the wiring was disconnected. There was no electricity running to the doorbell, so it shouldn't have rung at all. So like I said at the beginning of this story, I'm really curious as to who you think was ringing the doorbell. I have a pretty good feeling that it may have been the grandmother. Now, I did email back Rebecca, and she told me that there was no paranormal activity in her grandma's house that she was aware of prior to her grandma passing, and that there was really nothing else creepy that happened afterwards. It was just the weird doorbell incident. But that also makes sense because this was one of the last times they were in that house before it was sold. So it makes me wonder if maybe that was Grandma's way of telling them that she was still with them, or maybe her way of saying goodbye. I'm not sure, but it's definitely interesting. Our third story is very similar to the first story, and you will see why in a minute. But this one was incredibly creepy to me and very unsettling. So I definitely had to include it in this group of stories. And the person who sent in the story wishes to remain anonymous. They call it "They Knew My Name." So here's what they had to say. I was home alone one night when I heard knocking at the door. 3 knocks. Not aggressive or heavy, but just loud enough that someone was clearly expecting me to respond, and I assumed it was a neighbor. But when I opened the door, no one was there. I stepped outside, looked around. The street was quiet. There were no headlights, no people walking away, no kids. So I was a little confused, but I went back inside. About 5 minutes later, the knocking happened again. The same 3 knocks. This time, I didn't open the door right away. Instead, I walked closer and I stood there listening. That's when I heard something else. Someone knocked again, very softly, but this time they said my name just once, and I froze. The voice sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. And when I looked out the window, there was no one at the door. I checked my phone. My family was all asleep. No one had texted me. No one was outside. The knocking didn't happen again after that, and I never opened the door. So, as you can tell, this one was very similar to the first story because of the 3 knocks, and this was a very short one, but I wanted to include it because it was similar to the first story. So, I actually met this person through TikTok, and when we were messaging back and forth about this experience, they were saying that they almost felt like they were being summoned by the spirit on the other side of the door. Like if they opened the door the second time, whatever was on the other side would have came in. And they just had this feeling of dread and something in them that said, don't open the door. So they didn't. And thankfully, they've not had any other paranormal experiences like that. It's definitely scary. And this person was like, I've never had paranormal experiences. I thought I was crazy until I started researching and finding other people that also had these phantom knocks. And that's why they chose to share the story. So thank you to this person for sharing the story. We can assume that was a ghost, and I think similar to the first story, we can assume it's probably not the kind of ghost that you want to open the door to. Our fourth story is not paranormal, but it is creepy, and it goes well with the other stories that we've talked about today, and it's also a good cautionary tale of why you do not open the door to someone that you do not know. This story was sent in from Sarah, and she titled it, The Day I Almost Died. And here's what she writes. Hi, Mary. I was babysitting at a house I knew well. I had watched these kids a dozen times before. It was a quiet suburban neighborhood. Nothing about the house ever felt strange, and it was considered a safe area of town. I had spent the evening playing with the kids, and around 9 p.m., once the kids were asleep, I heard a knock at the front door. I peeked through the curtain at the window beside the door and didn't see anyone on the porch, so I assumed someone had the wrong house. I was also 16 at the time, and my parents had drilled into me that you do not open a door to someone you don't know, so I assumed someone had to have the wrong house, and I just didn't answer it. But a few minutes later, the knocking came again, louder, like they were frantically trying to get in the house. Once again, I didn't answer. But then the knocking moved. First the back door, then the sliding glass door, then the kitchen window, then the bedroom windows, each time knocking loudly like they were trying to get into the house. They circled the house a couple of times before I became so panicked that I called the parents of the kids I was babysitting and I asked them if they were expecting anyone to stop by the house. They said no, told me not to open the door under any circumstances and to call the police immediately. So that's what I did. I called the police and I called my parents. Within minutes, the police were there. And shortly after, both my parents and the parents of the children I was babysitting showed up. A few days later, as my parents were watching the local news, they found that down the street, one of the residents had been unalived by their boyfriend in a domestic dispute, and that the person who did the unaliving was running through the neighborhood trying to hide from the cops. The person was armed and frantic and actually held one of the neighbors hostage briefly before the cops were able to take them away. So I often wonder if I had opened the door, what would have happened to me and what would have happened to the children I was babysitting. The best lesson my parents ever taught me was to not open the door to someone I didn't know. And because of that, I am alive today, but I also never babysat there again. So I thought that one went well. And like this person said, if she had opened the door, would this have been a different outcome? I don't know, but it's scary. Now, they did not tell me what city or town this happened in. They didn't wish to disclose that information. but it's a sad situation. I'm glad they didn't open the door. So thank you to Sarah for sharing this story with us. And that brings us to the end of the episode, Unexplained Knocking and Ringing Doorbells. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. Follow me on social media. Leave a comment because I love hearing from all of you. If you have a story you would like me to share on the podcast, you can send me an email to thespookyfilespodcast@gmail.com or send me a message on social media. I read every single message, and it helps us build a community of people who don't just love a spooky story, but want a safe place to talk about all the things we don't always admit out loud. If you're looking for more paranormal content, check out my other podcast, Hoosier Myths and Legends, where my sister and I talk about all things spooky from the state of Indiana. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep it spooky, my friends.